Hello and good morning. It's so good to be able to be with you today and to join you in this great series all about well-being. And this is such a timely moment to be talking about this, isn't it? Because we've become so much more aware of all of our own emotions and just how important emotional well-being is. And it's so tempting to think about mental health and emotional well-being and topics like this as things that really are just for other people, issues that affect other people. But the truth is, as we've all discovered in these last 10, 11 months, life can put us under pressure. And when things are stressful, when things are challenging, when tough times kick in, we can all struggle. And interestingly, stress isn't always about distress. And I know that you guys have been hearing a lot in these last few weeks about the story of Elijah. And this is such a fascinating study of the way that our emotions can take us by surprise. I mean, think about it. In the story in 1 Kings 18, Elijah is at the peak of his ministry. I mean, he's just carried off this awesome, dramatic victory. He's seen the full power of God released. And all in the most amazing mountaintop location. He should be feeling like a superhero. But then again, Elijah isn't a superhero, is he? Actually, none of us are. That's awkward. We'd like to be. So many stories of our culture are about superhuman abilities, being able to pull off something superhuman. But the truth is, Elijah, just like us, he's human and he's tired. And stress is about anything that requires you to act or react to busy times, demanding times, the best times sometimes. But things that do ask a lot of your brain or your body. And Elijah has had a really full-on few days. And at the start of chapter 19, what we see is something totally unexpected happening. Elijah gets the Old Testament equivalent of a really nasty email. It's from Jezebel. It's like when someone sends you a really nasty tweet. And this totally floors him. He freaks out and he flees. He runs into the desert and he ends up sitting on his own and telling God he's had enough and he wants to die. Today, I want to talk to you about overwhelm. And overwhelm is something that most of us will have experienced to some degree in this last pandemic season. And overwhelm is something that can seriously threaten your and my emotional well-being. So let's start by thinking about how emotions are actually designed to operate in your mind. It's easy to think that they're just a nuisance. Emotions like anxiety and frustration and sadness. We often think we'd be better off just without them, but actually they're part of the normal, healthy functioning of your human mind. And they're triggered when your brain detects something going on in the world around you that might be important. Something you might need to do something about, something that might need your attention. So they're a bit like smoke alarms going off in your brain. They divert your attention away from all the busyness, all the other things going on that could distract you, and they make sure that you don't miss something that could be really important. They harness your thinking, analytical brain to make good decisions. Do you need to do something? Do you need to act? And they help you process what's going on and the significance of a moment in the bigger story of what's going on in your life, in your world, in the things that really matter to you. But your brain needs an emergency mode, a kind of crisis setting. What does it do when the things that are going on around you are so significant, so important? They're kind of life or death moments. They're not times to stand and analyse. They're moments where you just need to do something. And we can think of any emotion like anxiety or anger on a 0 to 10 scale. There's this point somewhere about 8 where you enter this zone that's like an emergency crisis zone. And it's the space where your brain presses that red alert button because it needs you to react really fast. And there's many things that happen when your brain is operating in that emergency zone. One of them is that it turns right down your ability to think analytically, to process. And it also triggers thoughts and sensations that are designed to get you to retreat, basically to get out of trouble, to do what you need to do, and then get out of the situation as quickly as you possibly can. Now, here's an awkward truth about the physiological system that's involved in emotions like anxiety and frustration in particular. And this is it. It's the same system as your physiological stress system. So in life's busy or demanding times, when your baseline stress has risen just because you've got a lot going on, your mind is trying to coordinate many different balls you've got in the air, it's like the baseline on that 0 to 10 scale, you're already at like 6 or 7. So a small emotional trigger, the kind of thing that you would normally handle no problem, maybe it's like pushing you 1 notch up on that scale, that actually can become a real difficulty, because if you're already at 7, 1 more notch up on that scale can push you into that emergency crisis red alert mode. Not because it's really an emergency, but because you are already living on the edge of your human limit. Did you know you have limits to your brain's capacity for how much it can keep juggling at any one time, limits to your energy because you do get exhausted. And when the other things going on in the world around you mean that your baseline has moved right up, it's like you're living on the edge of overwhelm. Does that sound familiar? I think with everything that life has thrown at us over the last 11 months or so, many of us have been living on the edge of overwhelm for some or all of that time. And particularly right now, those of you who are homeschooling like we are, it feels like very much like you're pushing the limits just on a normal day. And it takes an impact. We can see it on Elijah. You see, the truth is sometimes we struggle with our emotional well-being because of bad decisions or things we've got drawn into or wrong thinking. But it's important to remember sometimes too, it's just about biology or physiology, because as human beings, we do have limits. And if life has pushed us right to the edge of those limits, we risk living in that overwhelm zone. It's like when the water level's gone over your head and you literally start to feel like you're going under, you're drowning. And Elijah is a good example of what happens then. You know, his rational mind is not working well. He's flooded with panic. He makes dramatic decisions, impulse decisions. He feels like his only choice is to run. His mind is desperately trying to get him away from demand and challenge, so he retreats into isolation. He's all on his own. He's out in the desert. He's in a risky space. Though thankfully, of course, God has him covered and sends an angel to look after him. But in those moments, your mind is desperately trying to simplify all the decisions that you have to make because it's just exhausted. It's just bombarded. Life has felt relentless. And so it feels like everything's suddenly very binary. Things are either one thing or another. They're either black or white. Now, most of life is actually lived somewhere in the grey zone in the middle, but when you're overwhelmed, it doesn't feel like that. And of course, because your brain is on high alert, it's looking out for possible risk or problems. It's much more easy to feel like everything is the negative one of those two options. So it feels like you're either succeeding or you're failing. Guess which one you normally feel like you're doing. You're either good at something or just terrible at it. Again, guess which one? People are either for you or they're against you. Are you seeing a pattern here? So in the bad moments when we're already exhausted and overwhelmed and in a difficult time in life, you just start to feel like you are useless and everything is against you. And it adds to that feeling of overwhelm and so quickly becomes a vicious cycle. And in Elijah's story, we can tell he's not thinking clearly. When he eventually does talk to God, he says the Israelites have rejected your covenant. They've torn down your altars. They've put your prophets to death. I am the only one left. It's such a strong expression of how alone he feels in this moment, but it's not actually true. 1 Kings 18 verse 4 tells us there are actually 100 odd prophets living in caves. But in that moment, Elijah's mind is telling him he is alone. He is in big trouble. There is no hope. It feels as bad in that moment as he's expressing it to God, but it isn't actually completely true. This pattern at its worst, when we're in overwhelm and our mind has turned in on itself, it can take us to some bleak places. Elijah is exhausted. His mind is totally overwhelmed and in that place because it can't think of possible solutions. Its ability to problem solve has dropped so much. It can only think of one solution. He just wants to escape and rest. Listen, it's so important that we recognize the humanity of this story. This is an amazing man of God. He's a brilliant guy. He's full of potential, but burnout and emotional exhaustion has hit him. And this is a true story. This can and does happen to people now, all the time, particularly in this season. So many people are struggling on the edge of burnout. It could happen to any of us. It could happen to me. It could happen to you. And we so often think it couldn't. We think we're immune. But the truth is, if you are human, this could happen to you. We have to keep an eye on our emotional well-being because ultimately, even suicidal thoughts like Elijah experiences, these are more common than most people recognize. They're not a sign of weakness or failing. They're a sign that you're human and that you're under pressure that is pushing you beyond what you can manage. If you're finding yourself in that place right now, remember, things are unlikely to be as bad as your mind is telling you they are. There will be other options. It's so important that you reach out and get some help from somebody who's able to help you to figure out where to go next. But we need to take our well-being really seriously. And particularly the moments when we're at risk of being pushed into overwhelm. Life can be tough. Storms blow up. And in those moments when it's like the waves are coming over the boat, we can feel like we're going under, feel like we're sinking. So how do we manage our emotions well? That's what I want to talk about for the rest of our time together today. And I love the language of the New Testament when it comes to emotions. And particularly, I love the example of Jesus, because this is God living in the brain and body that he designed. And he's without sin. So he really knows what he's doing. And we can look to Jesus, look at how he manages those tricky human emotions and gain some top tips for our own life. We know we're following a really good example. So let me just think about 3 things we can learn from Jesus' life about how to look after our own emotional well-being, even in a crazy time like the one we're living through right now. And number 1 then is watch out for overwhelm. This is another thing that Jesus says. It's in John 14:27. And he's talking to the disciples and he says, I leave the gift of peace with you, my peace. Not the kind of fragile peace given by the world, but my perfect peace. Don't yield to fear or be troubled in your hearts. Instead, be courageous. That's the Passion Translation if you're looking at a slightly different one. And literally the Greek words that Jesus uses when he's speaking, because he's talking in Greek, it's translated into English. Literally what they mean is don't let fear stir up trouble in your heart. And that is such good advice when it comes to avoiding overwhelm. Remember, the emotions that you're experiencing right now are not sinful or wrong. There will be moments in life where you experience difficult emotions. They're part of what it means to be healthy and to be human. In fact, almost anything in life that's worth doing will trigger difficult emotions. It's not just the bad stuff. Think about it. Relationships, having children, starting a new job, moving house, all these big significant moments in life. They trigger emotions. They carry emotional power, particularly anxiety, because if things matter to you, your brain is likely to trigger a degree of anxiety to make sure that you keep an eye on them, that you don't forget about them because they're important. We need to learn not to fear our own emotions so we can hold them with acceptance and learn to manage them well. Otherwise, we end up taking the original emotion and adding to it fear of what we're experiencing, like, oh my goodness, I don't want to feel like this. What do I do? It's horrible. Or guilt, like, if I was a better person, I wouldn't be feeling this way. I'd be handling it better. And that's just going to make it harder. It just adds to your emotional load and it risks pushing you into overwhelm. You know, there's this story in Matthew's Gospel, in Matthew 14, about a moment in the disciples' life when they're caught in rough weather trying to get across the Sea of Galilee. And it's the story when Jesus actually walks out across the water to join them. And in their panic, and perhaps understandably, because it's slightly unexpected, but they don't recognize him and they become even more afraid and they're proper freaking out. And he says to them, do not fear. But the Greek word he uses actually refers to a really specific type of fear, and it's about panic and overwhelm. And it refers to moments when you feel like your capacity to do anything about the situation has been completely exceeded, and the only option is to run, is to flee, is to get out. So Jesus says to them, do not fear, do not panic, do not feel overwhelmed. And it's not a reprimand, it's a reassurance. He's not telling them off for being anxious. He's not saying, oh, you idiots, you're a bit weak-minded. What are you doing being anxious? It's understandable. They're under pressure. They're in the middle of a storm and it's been going on for ages and they're exhausted. What he's saying to them is, you don't need to feel overwhelmed by this. You're not going to sink. I've got you. You don't need to run. So we can't eradicate difficult emotions from our life, but we can learn to hold them. And we can learn to avoid being pushed into panic and overwhelm. And that will make it much less difficult in life's toughest times. Number 2 is about expressing your emotions. And did you know that's a good thing to do? And in our culture, we're not always super keen on expressing emotions. We're not the most emotionally expressive of people. But in John's Gospel, this time in John 11, there's a story of another emotionally powerful moment in Jesus' life. And it's when a good friend of his is ill and he's going to see him. But for various reasons, by the time Jesus gets there, this guy whose name is Lazarus, he's already died. And Jesus is met when he walks into the town by a wall of grief before he even gets to the house. Now, bit of a spoiler alert here. This is actually the story of a miracle because Jesus goes on to raise Lazarus from the dead. So you think in that moment that everybody's weeping and wailing and absolutely overwhelmed with grief, that Jesus would just say to them, like, don't panic, I've got it all sorted. Everybody calm down. Let's go up to the house. Let's sort it out. But actually he does something really unexpected. He cries, he weeps. And not like just sheds a delicate tear for a cinematic moment. No. He properly sobs. He gives real expression to his emotions. He joins in with the grief of that moment. Now that only makes sense if there is something really important for us as human beings about letting our emotions be expressed. There's something in the release, something in the way it connects us with the other people around us in life's powerful moments. It matters. You know, in this season, there's been so much around about positivity, and positivity is good in the right way. But emotional well-being isn't about denying the presence of negative emotions. It's not saying you mustn't ever admit that you're feeling rough. In a short-term crisis, that's what we do instinctively. We're kind of head down, suppress what you're feeling, get on with it. You can process, express, talk about it later, maybe when this is all over. But you can't live like that long-term. It's exhausting. Remember, the job of your emotions is to get your attention. So trying to hold them down is like trying to push a beach ball under the water in a swimming pool. You know, you get it down and then it pops up somewhere else. And the more you're trying to do that, the harder work it is and the more likely it is to fail. This particularly becomes a problem in moments when we're vulnerable or tired, when difficult emotions can suddenly bubble up and just overwhelm us, just like they did for poor old Elijah. Sometimes it happens when we least expect it, and the impact on our level of control and the way that we act and react to little things can be massive. So expressing your emotions really matters. And then number 3 is about how we process and share our emotions. And this again is something we see Jesus do time and time again. He never feels guilty about his need to ponder and pray stuff through. In fact, this is quite a pattern for him. And there's 3 things that he does that is really interesting. Firstly, he's clearly a fan of alone time. Time and time again, we read that Jesus, even though he was frantically busy and inundated with people who are in need, he retreats to quiet places. This is a guy who was seriously in demand, and he only lived his ministry out in a few short years. You might have thought by our human terms and culture that he would have just pushed himself right to the limit, work now, work all the extra hours, pull the odd all-nighter, he can rest later in heaven. But no, he doesn't just work flat out. He prioritizes space for himself really proactively. In fact, the Bible tells us that as often as possible, he retreats to quiet spaces to be on his own. And this is really sensible. Your brain is not designed to cope with constant, relentless demand. That pushes you into overwhelm so quickly. And yet, in our 21st century culture, we are very often juggling several things at once, and our brains are increasingly getting exhausted, again, particularly in this season. Sometimes we're so busy, so stressed, so just distracted by all the things we're trying to keep going that we actually forget to even connect with ourselves and how we're feeling. Do you even know how you're feeling right now? If someone says to you, how are you? Do you know the answer? I've had people ask me that in the last 10 months, and I've been like, I have no idea how I am. I'm so focused on everything else, I haven't even stopped to think. Maybe you need some alone time, some headspace. Secondly, though, Jesus, although he did do stuff on his own, he also spent a lot of time with his best mates. And there was this group of 12 guys who he hung out with, also some women who journeyed with him. He had this little group of people he did life with. But in the most emotionally powerful moments in his life, we read in the Gospels that several times he takes 3 guys, Peter, James, and John, with him. This smaller group of really close mates, people who knew him on a more intimate level, who shared some powerful moments with him. They were particularly close friends, and he actively invites them to be with him when he needs some extra support. We all need that. We all need some good friends, spaces we can be real, people who really see us, who know what's going on in our minds, who know the things that we're worrying about, the difficulties that we're wrestling with. It's not always about intense, in-depth conversations. Some of us aren't big talkers. Some people are very internal, very in their own heads. It's not about having to splurge everything out. Don't worry if that's not the sort of person you are. That's not what I'm saying. But it's just about sharing with some people, having them around you. There's this moment in Gethsemane when Jesus is facing something enormous and he doesn't really chat a lot to them. He talks a lot to God, but in that moment, he just has these guys with him. I wonder who sits with you in your most difficult moments. And I do wonder who can you talk to when that's something you can do. But when you're struggling even to put into words what you're feeling, who will sit with you in silence and just hold that moment? That stuff is part of processing emotions, and it really matters. And then thirdly, of course, Jesus prays. He actively and proactively connects with his Father. And note, he had a kind of unusual level of connection with God anyway, but he still makes this a real priority. And so this, for us as human beings, is so important. And it's where I want to finish today, actually, and pause just as we pray and ponder what God is saying in this moment. Because if there's one thing this season has made apparent, it's just how real our limitations are as human beings. The limits to our capacity, the limits to our cleverness, the limits to our control. But the good news is, when you reach the end of you, it's not the end. When we are overwhelmed, when we're feeling out of our depth, when we're in moments when we don't know what to do or we feel like we're sinking, actually God reaches out to us and offers us the chance to connect with something bigger, something better, something brighter than our own human cleverness. with God's complete, infinite, all-knowing capacity. And there's this well-known verse in John 16:33 where Jesus is talking to the disciples about the uncomfortable truth that life will have tough times. He says, in this world, we will have trouble. And he uses this Greek word that talks about moments when you feel under pressure, where you feel at the edge of your limits, where you feel hemmed in by your troubles, like trapped, you just don't know what to do. Life will have moments like that. Global pandemic is probably an unusual, quite drawn out example, but life will always have those moments. And Jesus says, take heart. And that's a literal active, taking control of your emotions, like take a deep breath. Remember this, he says, I have overcome the world. Literally says, I will prevail. God will win. Did you know that God's got you in whatever you face today? That's such a good foundation to build your emotional well-being on, to root yourself in. You know, no matter how dark current times look, no matter how negative it feels like the story that's being told about your life, or the bigger global world story that seems to be playing out in the media or in the statistics or whatever it is, we know the end of humanity's story is written, and it's a good one. God will prevail. There are better times ahead. This is going to end okay. I don't know how and I don't know when, but I do know that God's got us. So if today finds you in a moment of overwhelm, I want to just pray with you in a moment of pause. And I want to suggest that maybe you just take that moment to feel, to connect with what you're feeling without fear or judgment. And to know that as God sits alongside you, as you do that he longs to talk to you, that he's got you safe, that it's going to be okay. You don't need to run. You're not going to drown. Remember, there are better times ahead. So, Father, I speak supernatural peace over everybody as they're watching today. And I just pray that as we try and hold ourselves on the edge of overwhelm and panic and difficult emotions, you would be with us. I thank you for your presence with us and your supernatural support and love and reaching out to us in those moments. Help us, Lord, to make good decisions about our emotional well-being. But most of all, thank you that we don't do life alone. In Jesus' name, amen.